So we talked about Alfred Binet. We talked about this sort of context where people were starting to look at mental retardation and developmental delays and those kinds of things differently. They were seeing that as something that was treatable and even, curable to a certain degree. And so they wanted to start identifying those students that needed the extra sort of intervention and help. So Alfred Binet started to work to design this intelligence scale, which first started off, it was like 30 items, the increasing difficulty, and they tried to standardize everything from the questions that were asked to the administration. Like the person who was giving the test out had to follow specific steps, and everything that was said, the instructions had to be uniform. And they put out another version. There's been multiple versions of this, but in 1908, it turned into sort of what was called the Binet-Simon scale at the time. Had greater reliability, had a bigger standardization sample, and this is where you first saw this idea of mental age that we talked about last time. That if you know as much as the typical 20-year-old and you are 20 years old, which is a chronological age, then your IQ is about 100. You're about an average IQ. So they started to norm the test based on people's age. If you know as much as someone who's 30 and you're 20, then you have a higher IQ. If you know as much as someone who's 15 but you're 20, then you have a lower IQ. All right, so they were sort of match based on these sort of bands of people in terms of age, and norming sort of that way. Okay, and then the last thing I had mentioned was a bit of dark spin on some of this stuff, where the intelligence scale that we know, or as we know it, that's been used for quite a long time, is called the Stanford Binet intelligence scale. Stanford Binet. So in 1911, around then, Binet dies. So there's some minor revisions to the Binet-Simon scale, and 1912. It gets revised again to become the Kuhlmann-Binet, extends testing downward to 3 months of age. So they're able to now sort of test kids even younger. And so they're doing work to sort of expand it. And then 1916, this guy named Louis Terman at Stanford University decides, they hear about this scale over in France, and they want to bring it over and adopt it to use in English and with, American respondents. So they start to revise the Binet's test for that purpose. Now, they start to apply things, use more psychometrically sound sort of procedures, make sure that the items are reliable and valid. They start to sort of increase the validity of the test. And they're the ones that actually took this idea of mental age a step further and started to actually divide the mental age by people's chronological age to calculate a person's intelligence quotient, which is what IQ stands for, intelligence quotient. And what I mentioned before, this sort of dark side of this is Louis Terman was another eugenicist. This is someone who believed, that desirable traits should be allowed to survive, and those that are less desirable should basically die off. And the people that have less desirable traits shouldn't be allowed to procreate, don't pass down their genes. So in that context, it makes it seem sort of scary. So you had this guy leading this movement to bring this intelligence test over. Remember, the intelligence test originally was supposed to identify kids who needed more resources. Yeah, so let's identify kids who are struggling, having issues in their classes and in their education, and let's actually funnel sort of more resources to them so that they can actually be helped to, be brought up to their peers. And then you got someone who's a eugenicist. That seems to be the exact opposite of what they would want. So it seems like in some way the motivation in the beginning to bring the Stanford Binet, or to bring the Binet test over the United States, was to maybe identify kids so that they could funnel resources away from them or something. I don't know that for fact. Like, it's not written down someplace that this is what they're trying to do. But the fact that he's a eugenicist trying to bring over an intelligence test to the United States makes it awfully suspicious. And luckily, it didn't end up being used that way, at least not in a wide scale sort of use. And it's been used as an intelligence scale, and how people use it really is dependent on who's using it. I'm sure it has been used for. I mean, I know for a fact it's been used for negative purposes because I mentioned that the book The Bell Curve, where the author used I don't know if it was a Stanford Binet per se, but seeing as that was the leading intelligence scale for quite a long time, he said that he used intelligence measures to argue that underrepresented minorities, African Americans, Hispanics, lots of different groups that were mentally inferior to Caucasians. And so people have used these things for negative purposes. But again, you got to remember this scale was brought to Stanford. It was standardized and probably normed based on folks in and around Stanford University. So if you use a bunch of middle-aged, middle-class Caucasian respondents as your norm, anybody that's not in that class is going to seem different. They're going to respond in a different way. So they use that argument to say anything about someone's actual intelligence becomes very, very complicated. And it's been criticized over and over again. But I imagine that may have been what Lewis Terman was after in the very beginning, was to try it was something like that. But luckily, again, it's not been used like that, at least not consistently or systematically that I know of. And typically, intelligence tests and other things are used to sort of figure out where people are and to sort of funnel resources to them. There are interesting things where IQ has been used in interesting ways where if, I'm not sure if it's that way anymore, but there was a certain IQ cutoff that if you were below that cutoff, it was considered the cutoff for mental retardation, and I think it was like 70 or something like that. If you're below that you couldn't, in some cases couldn't be tried as an adult, or at least not a cognitive, not an independent adult at that point. So, like for instance, if you were convicted of murder, you couldn't be given the death sentence if you were below an IQ of 70 or something like that, because you're considered not of sound mind. You didn't know what you were doing. And I remember there was a case, and again, this is vague memory, where there was a person on death row that was trying to petition to retake an IQ test and stuff, because he was like at 71 or something, and he was trying to take it so he could actually get a lower score. Therefore, he couldn't be executed or something like that. So there's been interesting uses of IQ and stuff after it sort of developed to identify and again help students who needed the help, but it wasn't always used that way. Okay, so World War I comes around. There's a guy named, I'm pretty sure it's Robert Yerkes. So Robert Yerkes, there's a need because of all the, again, going back to this idea of doing testing for people in terms of their jobs, to figure out fit for people to go into different positions. This became even more important with the Army and military services. So they needed to figure out a way to do large-scale group administratability tests for the Army. So they commissioned this guy Yerkes. He was the head of the American Psychological Association to develop two structured tests of ability. The Army Alpha and Army Beta. The differences there was that one required reading, the other one did not. And then there's this sort of testing frenzy that hits, between World War I and the 1930s, where testing becomes, it goes sort of crazy. Trying to put people into positions in terms of jobs or positions within the military to make decisions of who could actually move up in service and that kind of stuff. All that started to come down to these tests that they were giving everybody. So this sort of, continues going forward. And this idea of this Army Beta is interesting because it was the first time that there was an acknowledgement here that reading was directly connected to their ability to test someone's intelligence, right? So if you were someone who was really smart but just had never learned to read or didn't learn to read very well, or for that matter couldn't read because you were blind or other issues where it impaired your reading, it was gonna make it seem like you were less intelligent than you really were. So they developed this test that didn't require reading ability, and that's what it took off in terms of, in 1937, they did another revision of the Stanford Binet, but around that same time is when the Wechsler Belleview test, right, of intelligence. This is David Wechsler. So the Wechsler Belleview was supposed to be sort of a rival intelligence measure to the Stanford Binet, but instead of having one intelligence score, you now started to have multiple scores. That's one big difference. And two, it started to have more components that didn't require reading. They were trying to move away from the heavy requirement of the reading in most of these other tests, and they had performance type tests where you had puzzles and you had to figure things out without having to write or to read passages and things. So these were adopted from those sort of Army scales, and you got the sort of verbal performance, and then you got a full scale. So the full scale is similar to the Stanford Binet intelligence, their IQ score. But then you also got subscores for verbal, which is, again, looks like Army Alpha, and performance, which is more Army Beta. And that eventually evolves into the Wechsler series, which is like the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and the WISC, which is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. And again, they're just like the Stanford Binet, very standardized set of instructions. Everything has to be done a certain way, and but a lot of the tests, the subcomponents, didn't require reading. They were more performance based, like puzzles. They would show you blocks that made a certain pattern, and you had to make those blocks into the same pattern and stuff like that. We'll talk more about that as we go through towards the end of the session. We'll talk more in depth about the Stanford Binet and actually go through some examples and look at the actual test of the Stanford Binet and the Wechsler scales. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit from intelligence testing to sort of where sort of personality testing sort of came back in and sort of took off a little bit more. In the 20s, there was like a rise of this idea of sort of doing personality tests and figuring out what kind of personality you had. And in the 1930s, it was sort of everyone, thought that the movement in the 20s was sort of hokey. That it's almost akin to like tarot card reading or something. It wasn't really scientific. And then there was in the 40s, it sort of came back around again when they tried to standardize testing for personality and stuff. So these were intended to measure traits. So you'll hear a lot about scales that measure state versus trait levels. Like there are state and trait versions of anxiety scales. There's state anxiety and trait anxiety. So state anxiety measures your anxiety in a temporary condition. So, if you put someone in a scenario where, I don't know, they get surprised or there's something, they measure their anxiety in a scenario like that, where trait anxiety is supposed to measure their sort of long-lasting sort of disposition, that they just are an anxious person. That even in a perfectly calm, relaxing environment, they're anxious. My wife and I have this discussion a lot because I'm pretty laid back, like very mellow, to the point where like if I were to lay down on the floor, which is gross, it's like a dirty floor. If I was to lay on the floor, I could take a nap right now. I could just go to sleep. That's just how I am all the time. My wife, on the other hand, is sort of a little more high-strung, even though she hates when I use that term, but she's a little more anxious, a little more of a worrier, a little more, stuff like that. I always talk about that her relaxed is still more anxious than my anxious. You know what I mean? Like when I'm anxious, she's still more anxious than I am when she's like at her most relaxed, right? So there's just a tendency, there's a certain trait people have to be just sort of more anxious. So most of the time in these sort of personality tests, they're trying to get at not state levels of things, not like, oh, you're neurotic in this condition or in this certain circumstance. There's a trend, a tendency for neuroticism, or a tendency for openness, or a tendency for all these different sort of personality traits that are being measured. So that's why it's talking about here. Trait is a relatively enduring disposition. It's a tendency to act or feel or do certain things like all the time, regardless of circumstance. Right. So these are not the sort of temporary states, even though there are measures for state levels of a lot of these things as well. So the first sort of rise and fall. So they tried to create structured personality tests in the same way that intelligence tests were developed. Let's give people a bunch of questions, and then we can be able to decipher if they have personality, what kind of personality traits they have, and specifically if they have like dangerous or problematic personality traits, like being psychopathological or some other thing. Can we actually use questions to do that? So they started to develop this stuff. So instead of just looking at skills, right? Because there's skills like intelligence that can help you place people into jobs and where they'd be good or bad at things. But there's also personality traits that would make people better or worse at jobs as well. So they're trying to develop objective personality tests that could aid or potentially replace sort of psychiatric interviews. So these started to be developed during World War I, and they were designed to screen out soldiers that are unfit for duty. So again, the goal here is not, let's just measure people's personality. They're literally trying to figure out if there's a way to bar soldiers from entering into, to service based on some negative traits or personality quirks they might have. And the problem, though, is, and this, you look at it now, it seems like, well, that's ridiculous. They mistakenly assumed that a subject's responses could be taken at face value, meaning that people wouldn't be motivated to fake their answers or to lie. Right? They thought, people will answer honestly and will be able to figure out their personality traits based on their responses, without taking into consideration that if I'm answering certain questions, I may lie because I don't want people to know that about myself, or I don't want to admit that there's certain, flaws or something like that. So let me look at some of these questions. For one of the first ones was this thing called the Woodworth Personality Data Sheet. So right away, right, you're an adult, you're a soldier potentially trying to, go into service. First question: I wet the bed. Yes or no? So even if you did, are you going to say yes? Probably not. That's probably not something you're going to include on a service entry exam or something like that. I drink a quart of whiskey each day. All right. Again, even if you did, probably not gonna answer. I'm afraid of closed spaces. I believe I'm being followed. People are out to get me. Sometimes I see or hear things that other people do not hear or see. There's a couple of issues with some of those. One, it's like the idea that people would answer honestly to these questions is sort of ridiculous. But also there's issues with some of these. So like, I believe I'm being followed. That's only problematic if you're not actually being followed, right? If you're paranoid or something, like people are out to get me. If they aren't, but what if they are? What if people are actually following them, or people are out to get them? They're going to seem like they're paranoid or have some delusional disorder, when in fact they're not. I'm afraid of closed spaces. This one's probably the most functional question in terms of, if you really are afraid of closed spaces, there's probably a lot of jobs you probably shouldn't be doing. You're probably not someone's going to be, climbing around inside of airplanes to work as a mechanic, because there's some very tight spaces for you to go into to do that. So some of these other ones, I'm sure wet in the bed's probably not a good thing either. But again, they're likely not even to tell the truth, and even how diagnostic are they of certain things, because you don't know what the actual facts are. Sometimes I see or hear things that other people do not hear or see. Now, I would actually say, like, if I was answering this, I would actually say yes to this question, but not for the reason you think. It's because I oftentimes notice things that other people don't notice. So, I'll say, hey, we're watching a movie with my wife or, whatever, someone. I'm like, oh my God, you see that, poster in the background or whatever? Like, what? I go back and, I notice things that other people don't notice. So I'm going to actually answer yes to this, and then they might think that I'm crazy and see things like I have hallucinations or something. So some of these questions can be tricky, the way that which people interpret the questions as well. So there's issues with the wording and other things, lots of problems. Okay. So along with this idea of these sort of objective tests, right, we're also the beginning of projective tests. This is where you're supposed to project your personality or your things onto certain objects. One of the first ones, it started to be used really without a lot of research in the 20s, meaning that Rorschach started to use ink blot tests to diagnose folks and that kind of stuff without really having any systematic research done to see if it was reliable, valid, that sort of thing. The first serious study wasn't done until like 10 years after it started being used. And there's a couple different versions of it. The original ones sort of look like this, where it was like these, they literally were like ink dropped in the paper and sort of folded to make different patterns. And then later they used, developed some these Rorschach cards that have that were multicolored, had different colors of ink that were sort of put in there. These were sort of the original ones. This is the one you sort of see often as like the, you know, the quintessential like demonstration of a Rorschach. Now the reason why you don't see a lot of Rorschach ink blots, like you don't see a lot of them out there, is because you're not supposed to. So the idea, these types of projective tests are not good. They don't really work if everyone's been exposed to them. It has to be something you've never seen before, and you're supposed to then project, you know, what you see onto the image. So when you look at this picture, you got to do sort of, you know, first impression. Like, what do you see when you look at this picture? What image sort of comes out at you? A beetle thing. Okay, I can see like the little pinchers at the top. What else? Anybody else see something else? Yeah, or like one angel with their wings out and their arms like up like this, like looking up. Yeah, I see that too. Yeah, or two about to high five or something. I see two angels high-fiving. Right, their hands there. Anyway, what else? Anyone else see something else? Nothing else? We got angels and a beetle. That's it. I remember the first time I saw this. I had many different things, but one of the things I saw first was it looked sort of like a fox mask. Like if you were like to wear a Halloween mask, it was a fox. You know, like it's not perfect, but like, you know, their sort of eyes and nose and their ears up at top. You know what I mean? Maybe with some like white coloring in their fur or something like that. It's sort of the first thing I saw was it looked like a mask. You know, that someone might wear. And it's interesting. Okay. Yeah, to me, you get the sort of ears or something up at the top there. It just reminded me of some kind of animal mask. But the first animal I thought of was either like a fox or a raccoon or something. That's sort of what struck me when I first saw it. And then what's interesting about that is I remember having that impression. And then later on, I think I mentioned this last time. There was a comic book and then a movie that was done a while ago, The Watchmen, and then there's now a TV show on HBO about The Watchmen. It's on my brain because I just watched the HBO series, which is really good. Even if not in the comic books, it's really, really super relevant to right now because it starts off, the very beginning of the show starts off at the Tulsa Massacre in 1921. That's sort of how the show starts. And it goes through sort of an alternate history of how things could have gone differently. But the main reason I mention that is the bad guy, one of the characters, the person's name is Rorschach, and it's basically he wears a mask that has this on his face, and all his followers wear the same sort of mask. It's not exactly this, but it's very similar. Sort of confirming the idea this looks sort of like a mask that someone might wear, and they sort of actually made it into a literal mask that they wear over their faces. Anyway. So, as you say things like, "Oh, it looks like a beetle," or "It looks like angels," or "It looks like whatever it is you saw," a trained, tester would then be making notes, and it's supposed to sort of help diagnose people with different personality disorders depending on how and what they saw in these different pictures. And a lot of that has been confirmed in some ways, where there's a lot of cognitive literature that shows that your brain will constantly try to find patterns, make sense out of things that you see. So this is a nonsensical sort of pattern. So your brain's going to try to make sense out of it. And how your brain makes sense out of it can tell you a little bit about you and how you think and how your cognitive processes sort of work. All right. So this is, again, vague ink blot picture. And these two, Henry Murray and Christina Morgan, decided to take it a step further. Instead of looking at these sort of nonsensical ink blots or whatever, they made this test called the Thematic Apperception test. They gave people ambiguous pictures, but they were actual pictures, like drawings, paintings. And it had much more structure than the Rorschach. Instead of just saying, what do you see in this picture? What do you see in this picture? What do you see in that picture? And just going through them, they would show scenes and ask people what events led up to that scene, or what caused this scene, or what's going on in this scene. So people would actually have to write stories based on this simple scene that was being set for them. So the characters are, they would ask, like, what are the characters feeling and thinking, and what the outcome of the story was, how the outcome turned out. And depending on how they responded and the kinds of details they included in the story, they could definitely pick up on themes and show that people are depressed or have anxiety or other issues based on what they tended to focus on in the photos. So here's an example. This one. So you got this photo, and they would ask, okay, what led up to this photo? What's going on in this photo? How are they feeling? And what was the outcome? Like, what happened sort of after this photo is over? All right, so I don't want to take time to write out a whole story here, but what do you think led up to this photograph here? First of all, what do you even see in the photograph? Right, so a scenario, this guy passed out drunk, wife's upset that her husband's home drunk again. What else? What's a different story? That she killed him? Or someone did, and now she's crying because the husband's been, or whoever this person is murdered. But, again, so what else do you see? What other scenarios could be going on? Right, so you get a lot of, she's having some kind of an affair on the husband's sleeping, and she's feeling the guilt or whatever because she doesn't want him to know. So while he's sleeping, she's sort of dealing with the guilt feelings of that, right? What else? You can see this is sort of, it's vague enough where there's all kinds of stories can come out of this. And it can tell you a little bit about the person and sort of what's going on in their own lives depending on how they interpret the scenario. I'm not going to do that with your answers, but I'm saying, like, someone who's trained in this could actually go through and pick up on themes, especially, it's oftentimes not just with one photo. Okay, so you would show one photo and they write the story or whatever, then you go on to another one, and you sort of pick up on the kinds of themes that people apply to the scenarios that seem consistent throughout many photos. So it's not often based on just one scenario, it's usually multiple. I remember one scenario too, it's like, if I remember right, a common one is that, like, they had just they're in a relationship. They had just had sex that was unfulfilling for the wife, and the male just went to sleep, and she's like unfulfilled. So she's now sitting there upset because she's in this unfulfilling relationship with this dude. That's why she's upset. There's all kinds of, themes of sort of sexual frustration, but definitely murder and death is in this one a lot. And you can see how people, what they tend to focus on, how they see this scenario, who they identify with in the picture, and all that kind of stuff can tell you a lot about, what they're going through and about their personality and the way that they interpret events. All right. So the first set of structured tests for personality didn't go so well. There were two obvious, and people had a tendency to want to lie. So there was in the 40s, there was a sort of second coming of these structured tests. In the 40s, they started to develop more on psychometric properties using things like test theory and stuff. And they started to build in things like lie scales, which they're questions that they will embed into these long personality inventories to see if someone has a tendency to lie. And what it is, it's like there will be multiple questions where it's the same kind of question, but they will ask it in different ways and see if a person will answer the same way to the question each time. There's also faking good, there's faking bad, there's all kinds of different ways in which they've built into some of these scales to try to track that stuff for people. So, one of the big ones is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It's been around since 1943. Still one of the biggest personality inventories. It's like an industry. People giving the test out. It gets sent to a testing agency to be tested, and then it comes back with all kinds of information. It takes like 3 hours to go through it. It's a bunch of questions, and they're all just statements, and you're supposed to just say yes or no if you agree with the statement or not. So tests like the Woodworth made too many assumptions, so they tried to not do that. The meaning of the test response could only be determined by empirical research, and the most widely used are the MMPI-2, which is the adult one, and then the MMPI-A, I believe, is the child one, even though it seems backwards, but I'm pretty sure that's true. I'm not positive about that anymore. I used to do some work with MMPI a long time ago, like when I was in graduate school at UCLA. We were looking at different scales in the MMPI and comparing boys and girls. I think the A maybe stands for adolescence on the adolescence scale, and then same thing looking at male and female responses in the MMPI-2. And this was like 30,000 respondents that we were getting directly from the MMPI folks that are over in MMPI is like out of Illinois. Is that right? No. I don't remember anymore. Been too long. But my advisor, Steve Reese, who is still at UCLA, was trained by the folks that doing. Oh, it's actually out of Minnesota. Duh. It's right there in the name, Minnesota. So it's right out of Minnesota. I'm thinking of ETS. ETS is in, I think, Illinois. Maybe I'm getting confused. Anyway, but so my advisor had gone there and did some work with folks on the MMPI scales, I think, and I remember he said that he's been back for a couple decades and he still hasn't been able to get the cold out of his system. Going to, I think, Minnesota to work on that stuff, so he was always freezing cold because of that. Anyway. All right, so the MMPI would come back with a ton of different scores on different subscales and things. And it would be helpful for psychologists, psychiatrists to look at different personality disorders, different psychopathologies like clinical depression or whatever. All right, so lots of stuff, tons of information. It's a super sort of meant to be all-encompassing sort of personality inventory. Around the same time, there was other types of personality questionnaires being developed that were being developed based on something called factor analysis. And so Raymond Cattell in 1940 is one of the first people to use factor analysis to try to figure out the number of dimensions, the number of dimensions needed to explain the relationships between many or a large set of items. So he had come up with this sort of 16-factor personality scale that looked at 16 different aspects of personality, all sort of empirically driven, meaning that unlike the MMPI at first, where they were sort of looking at different items, and how they related to each other based on content, other things, and based on sort of classical test theory, things like Cronbach's alpha and those types of things. This one was developed at the time, a sort of newer, fancier statistical method, and that mathematics was actually driving what items went together. So you had items that would go together on a subscale that on the surface you may not believe belong together because they don't seem like they would go together, but they do. For instance, with depression, it's often sort of surprising, for people that you have items about weight loss, right? That they've either gained or lost weight recently. Seems like it's like a odd question when it comes to all the other questions. Like, I feel sad. I sometimes I sometimes don't enjoy the things I used to. So all the questions on most depression inventories have a sort of, on the face value, seem like they're asking about depression. And you get questions like about sleep or eating that seem to be sort of non sequiturs in the depression questionnaires, but based on things like factor analysis, they show that those things actually do relate. Okay, so they're using sort of mathematics to sort of tell them what items tend to go as subscales and subfactors in a factor analysis. And this one, you have to have 16 different subfactors of personality. And I don't have it here, but those were used, have been used over and over again. This sort of argument about even using factor analysis between, is there one type of intelligence or are there multiple intelligences, all backed by factor analysis, even to the point of then this being refined down to what they call the Big Five personality inventory, which is like neuroticism. I always think it's like, it spells ocean: openness, conscientiousness, egocentrism, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Those are like the Big Five personality traits. And they're called the Big Five because those, in multiple studies found that those are the personality traits that seem to come out and are consistent. There are lots and lots of other ones, but those are the ones that people have focused on for a long time and seem to be the consistent and regularly found by things like factor analysis and confirmed over and over again. All right, last couple of things. Since that time, the 1940s, it's been lots and lots of changes where testing has become more and more important. It's become more and more standardized. There's lots of federal funding went into sort of training more clinically oriented psychologists, and that psychological testing is a unique function of clinical psychologists and ought to be taught to doctoral students, right? So more and more of testing was being integrated into not just the training of clinical psychologists, but the treatment of patients too. Like, you can't just treat patients, you actually need to do testing. So if you're going to be someone who's treating patients, you need to know how to test them as well. 1954, this position was sort of affirmed, and the relationship between psychologists and physicians grew more complex over these issues because physicians, doctors, psychiatrists, medical doctors thought that the testing and diagnostic stuff should actually be done by them, and that psychologists shouldn't be doing the testing, shouldn't be doing the diagnostic part. So psychologists often felt that they had this sort of secondary role, and there's been fights over and over again throughout the decades about whether or not psychologists should be allowed to prescribe certain medications, whether or not they should be able, to do the kinds of diagnostic testing, especially when it comes to, having someone committed into a facility or, making these sort of legal decisions. Should psychologists be able to do that, or should that be left to psychiatrists? And it's this ongoing back and forth thing. If you've ever been to a psychologist and a psychiatrist, you see there's a huge difference between the experience. You go to a psychologist, you're going to be there for an hour. They're going to talk, or you're going to talk. They're going to ask you questions. You're going to talk. Try and work out problems. They're going to try and reflect back to you and do all these sort of things that they're taught to do to help you sort of unburden yourself of things you got going on. Psychiatrists, you're going to wait for probably an hour, and then you're going to see them for maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, depending on, they can squeeze you in for a little longer. They're going to write you, they're going to ask you some questions, but they're going to seem like they really don't care about the answers, and then they're going to write you a prescription, and then they're going to bring in another person, and that's just, so psychologists see psychiatrists as sort of these pill dispensers that don't really do any other intervention besides sort of medication, and psychiatrists see psychologists as sort of wasting clients' time by just spinning their wheels and not really doing anything directly affects them. So it's sort of an odd dichotomy between them, and that's not gone away. It's still there, and it's going to be there, I think, forever. Anyway, psychologists felt like, they had the secondary role, and, there's a lot of pushback. And, from the 50s to the 70s, testing sort of declined again, at least to the point where we were doing the same kinds of testing in the 70s as we were in the 50s. Like, there wasn't a whole lot of changing, a lot of changes or growth. We just sort of got to a point and sort of stuck with it for a long time. And then, there's different areas of applied psychology have emerged since the 1980s. There's been a lot more things like neuropsychology and health psychology and forensic psychology and child psychology. These are all sort of ideas that were around, but they became their own sort of fields. You can actually get a PhD or something, in these, specific areas. Things like human factors. All these things sort of grew, and because of that, along with that became a new growth in testing, because with new areas and new kinds of tests, new kinds of things to be developed. So testing is not a major part of psychology training, but it extends way, way, way beyond the field of psychology. And I would say it's a major part, but it's actually probably not even incorporated as much as it should be. I mean, we have research methods and statistics as a regular required, prerequisite or requisite course in the major, but oftentimes testing is maybe an elective, if that. And sometimes, and usually only it's required once you go to, a master's or PhD level, especially in clinical psychology, because I know clinicians need to be able to interpret tests and be able to, to actually give the test and interpret it. So it's included there, but as undergraduates, most undergraduates, I think, would go through and never see a psych testing course. So, I don't know. Questions about all this stuff? It's trying to go through quick, but I don't know how quick that was.